Hello, welcome to the Praying Christian Women podcast. I am Alana. I am here with Jamie. How are you, Jamie?
Good. One of these days, I feel like you should say, I'm Alana, and then I should say, I'm Jamie, and then we should say something in unison, like, something like
Welcome to the
Broadway-ish,
Praying Christian Women podcast.
and we could do it in song so that it's like musical.
You,
But I just ruined the surprise.
well, do you know what? You do it in song and then I'll join in. Go ahead, I'm ready.
I'm Jamie.
Yeah, I'm Alana. Hi, everybody. It is good to be here. It is especially fun. I had such a great time visiting you in Utah.
I
For people
know, it
who
was so
missed
good.
last week, we got to record. It was our very first podcast episode that we recorded in the same place, and it was so fun.
I know. And I love that we got to record it and have it documented we did an Instagram live, which was fun. And I think we still need to figure out how that all works because I think we lost all the comments and we were so far from the phone during the
I
recording, we
know we
didn't
couldn't
get to
see
like
them.
interact with people. So if you commented during the live, we weren't ghosting you. We just lost it. So
Yeah,
thank you
we'll
for
figure
joining
it
us. It
out. But
was
yeah,
fun.
it would be fun to do more live stuff. So you can come and join us at Praying Christian Women on Instagram. And we have such exciting news. This episode comes out in February, which is our book's birth date. And She Prays Like a Girl is available at our store on christianbooks.today. We will also be posting the links in the show notes on social media and things like that. And it's been such a joy and honor to write this book with you, Jamie. And I'm so glad that we get to share it with the world now.
Oh, me too. And now, fun fact, I have three children now with birthdays in February.
That's right.
Yeah, our two boys have February birthdays.
And
So
now our book.
now our book baby. It's exciting.
I met an author. So I went to visit you in Utah, then ran to Austin for a conference, a writer's conference. And I met a woman there who is an author. And in a past life, she had a newborn photography business. And I told her
Oh,
how much I've always wanted just for fun to do a newborn photo shoot with one of my books. So maybe we'll do that the next time we're together.
that would be perfect. That would be absolutely perfect. Who's the one that does the really Ann Getty's? Remember the
Yes.
Ann Getty, Ann Getty? Yeah.
Those babies always kind of disturbed me. It's like babies in costumes and stuff. It was a little weird. And they're
Yeah.
always sleeping. I'm like, what's wrong with these little babies?
Is Benadryl involved?
Right. Well, hey, so I am glad that we get to go through some of these topics in our book for this next kind of batch or series of episodes. So last week, when we recorded live, we were talking about the importance of having examples of women praying. So specifically, if you're at the type of the church where 80% or more of the public prayers are being prayed by men, for example, that women aren't getting as many real life examples as we should be about the way that women pray. And so the very next question is, well, do women pray differently than men? And if so, how? And on the one hand, if you've thought about this before, you might really be, I could see like two very black and white answers. Well, no, God loves us all. We are all God's children. And the Lord's Prayer wasn't given like the version to pray if you're a man and the version to pray if you're a woman. So on the one hand, I think that some people are so black and white. Well, of course, men and women, we can all approach God, obviously. And so we all pray exactly the same. And then I think there are going to be some people who are like, well, of course we're going to pray differently. We have different friendships. We have different ways of relating to people. We have different communication styles. So of course we're going to pray differently than men. And then of course there's everything in between. So before we wrote this book, Jamie, had you thought about this question at all?
Yes, in a way. I mean, we had thought about everyone praying differently, everyone being an individual.
Yes.
But I had thought about this in terms of like my husband and I and how we
Hmm.
approach prayer. and just even how we approach communication, because prayer
Yes.
is communication. So I think it boils down to that. I think it's like the men are from Mars, women are from Venus
Mhm.
phenomenon, about which I know that's a controversial book, but I don't know, just the idea that men and women communicate very differently in general terms.
Yes.
And if we communicate differently, then of course we're going to pray differently. That's kind of how I had thought about it in general terms,
Hmm.
but I had not, like, I don't know, I hadn't vocalized it, I guess, or like distilled it down or thought about some
Right.
of the different ways that that manifests itself in our prayer lives until
Hmm.
we got into it in the book.
Yeah, I remember being a little bit surprised at myself as I was working on one of the chapters. And even when I went back and re-listened to our live, just as we were re-listening to make sure the audio worked and stuff, like I get a little surprised at myself at how heated I get about this
Yeah, right.
sometimes, because I do feel like a lot of women are not elevated to a position of feeling powerful. We don't feel like we have power in our families or in our workplaces or in politics. And that can bleed into our prayers, right? This feeling of, oh, I'm just a woman, or oh, I'm not on the church leadership board, so I can pray for the men who are making decisions, but that's kind of it. It's like, okay, you go stand here in this corner is how it sometimes feels. And again, I have a wide range of respect for lots of different churches, organizational structures. So again, we're not even asking the question of should women be pastors or things like that. It's just should women pray in church is what we started with. And if we come to, well, women should pray in church so that women have examples of seeing other women pray in church, that also leads to, okay, so maybe women do pray differently. I would say that like 20-year-old Alana would have said that there's no difference, that we all have a direct connection with the Lord and God loves us all equally. And so my prayers are just it, like if I were to read a book on how to pray, it wouldn't matter if that book was written by a man. And I still hold to that in certain aspects, right? However, there is the sense that as women, we bring so much uniqueness of personality into our prayers, whether we're men or women. And so much of our personalities is tied to the experiences that we have or the biology that we have that are unique to women. Are you hearing Gimli in the background? He's
A little bit of
squeaking on
scuffling and
everything right
snuffling.
now. Well,
Yes.
why don't you open us up in prayer before we go too much deeper, and then we can continue our discussion.
Alrighty. Let's let's pray. God, we thank you for creating each of us uniquely and beautifully. We thank you for the differences between men and women and the way that you have allowed us to operate in such important and specific ways in our world and in the kingdom of God. We just pray that you would guide and direct our discussion today, that you would just allow us to really reflect on what makes us uniquely feminine and what makes us uniquely women, and how those things can be used in powerful ways for your kingdom, rather than suppressing them or trying to mold ourselves into a more masculine, different kind of prayer, that we would really embrace our womanhood and just love those things about ourselves and harness them so that we can pray with power and passion and change the world with our prayers. Amen.
So for just for fun question, we've talked about kind of differences in communication styles. Do you have either just give us kind of the blanket, my husband and I communicate totally differently because of this, or if you have an example where like you were saying one thing, he was hearing something totally different. Do you want to tell us that kind of story?
We have a lot of those. So I would say that My husband tends to be a little bit more communicative and than the average stereotypical man. Like a lot of times you'll like this the thing that comes to mind is the cartoon. I don't know if it's the Far Side or what it is, but it has like the woman speaking or the man speaking and it's like a faucet with a drip coming
Uh-huh.
out of his mouth and the woman speaking and it's like a fire hose.
Right.
Have you seen that? I mean, just that
Uh-uh.
idea that women are very loquacious, very,
Right.
yeah. So I definitely, my husband is a little bit more communicative than that. I consider myself fortunate because we can communicate. I don't have to pry stuff out of him. But at
Mhm.
the same time, the one way it really does come out though is when I'm texting. I
Mhm.
I text people and I'm just when I write, I'm very wordy and I have to really watch it. I'm sure you know. Well, the
Any,
funniest thing is,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. You were going
No,
to say
you,
it, weren't you?
well, I don't know. Anytime I get multiple texts in a row and Scott's in the room, he'll be like, "What's
Ding,
Jamie talking about now?" Because yeah, it's like
ding.
text, 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 text,
And it's
text.
because like when I send really long ones, they come to you weird
Yeah.
because they get jumbled up or something. So I
Uh-huh.
usually like I'll write the whole thing and then I'll cut and paste smaller pieces just to send
Aw,
you several
I
ones just
didn't
because I
know that
don't
you
want
went
it
through
to
that
get
whole
jumbled.
trouble.
Well, just because
Yeah,
I don't want it to get all jumbled up.
I
You
know.
know,
Sometimes it was like a puzzle. It was like, here's five sentence fragments, put them in
yeah.
order.
So yeah, I just cut and paste and I send them.
Oh, I
But
didn't know that.
but I am just I suppose I could work on it, but I'm very wordy in my communication. And so my husband is not. He's way more to the point. And so I think what happens is he will say something and I think I feel the need to maybe reword it or reframe it to clarify
Hmm.
more that
Hmm.
maybe I don't feel exactly the same way, or he'll generalize what I'm thinking and I'll have to
Hmm.
kind of lay it out. And by the end of it all, we have totally lost each other.
Right.
So I think that's part of it is we definitely, I'm way more wordy than he is.
Yeah.
See, I could have just said that in the beginning. I'm more wordy. How
Well,
about you, Alana?
I'm going to
Any?
call you out actually for saying maybe you should work on that. And I'm going to say maybe you should lean into that,
Yeah,
right?
that is a really good point.
If you
Yeah.
know that you like taking your time to say what's on your mind, then writing a one sentence thing on Instagram isn't going to be the way that you're going to communicate with people well, right? Or, for example, maybe this is why we wrote a book and not produce a 45-second reel trying to state our thoughts on something. So I think that's a key takeaway is lean into how God did design you. I know for me, my husband, and this has more to do, in my opinion, with Clifton's strengths than with just the fact that he's a man and I'm a woman.
Hmm.
My husband's really, really high in the communication strength, like it's one of his top few. And what I realized is that that means for him, it's not communication if it's not verbal. And so for me, especially from my Japanese American side of things, you can say a lot with an eyebrow, or you can say a lot by not saying something, right? So if you say something that I think is horrifically offensive and atrocious, typically from the way I was brought up, I don't call you out on that, but I give you a look and I do this thing with my lips that I kind of, stick them together. And you know that I completely disagree with you and that I think
I'm
you're
over here taking notes
right.
ferociously. No.
Right. But I'm being, in my opinion, I am being super polite about it. Right. And I am being so tactful, but I am still speaking volumes to you.
That's a
What,
really good point. That's
but
really good.
what I realized with my husband is if I give him that look and I do not say, I completely disagree with you, it's almost as if I'm not being honest with him because he's saying, oh, your subconscious body language is telling me that you disagree, but your words are not. And so it's almost like if you don't say it with words, it's like you're holding back. And So I have had to work on that. Another thing that we've had to do, and this is again goes back to Clifton strengths. My one of my strengths is ideation. It's my number two. And that's, just like the big ideas and the brainstorming. And so I can go from A to W. And in my brain, the way I got from A to W is so self-explanatory. So it can kind of be like, so we're going to Utah, you're taking me to the airport. So of course I need to go to Amazon on Tuesday and make sure that the auto ship is set for 2 weeks from Friday. Like in my brain, it's just kind of like, well, obviously. And so if Scott and I are talking about me going to Utah, and all of a sudden I'm talking about subscribe and save, I need to realize like his brain doesn't follow me there. Nobody's brain
Mhm.
follows me there. I'm sure you've seen me do it too, where I'll be like, and so sometimes I just kind of need to start at the end and work my way back. So I'll need
Mhm.
to be like, okay, I'm going to start telling you this thing that seems totally unrelated. And then I'm going to kind of unravel that yarn to explain to you like why we're even talking about this.
So you know what reminds me, this whole conversation reminds me of the movie Frozen, where
Uh-huh.
Anna and who's the guy that she is interested in that do the song together? I can't remember his name, but Anna
Yeah,
and the guy, the swindler, whatever, the
right.
shyster.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're singing the song and she's like something about
We
we finish
finish
each
each other's.
other's. He says we finish each other's and she says sandwiches and he says that's what I was going to say when obviously it wasn't. But
Right.
that reminds me sometimes also of my husband and me
Oh.
when we're having conversations, when there
Hmm.
are times when we're really in tune and we
Yeah.
do align on a lot of things, but there are some times when we're talking and it's like that where we're both like, okay, we're on the same page, and then it's like, okay, show me what you got, and we're both like
Hmm.
totally opposite. So
Yeah.
there are definitely some differences in the
Yes.
male and female communication.
And just in individual to individual,
Right, and
right?
individual thought processes. And that's the other thing is, we in discussing the quote unquote like womanhood and the way women pray, just as a disclaimer, we may throw things out there that are true for us and maybe are
Hmm.
generalizations for women. By no means do we mean to offend anyone or make anyone feel alienated and less like a woman if you don't
Right.
have these particular things. We're speaking
Exactly.
in generalizations because there are certain things that are pretty general, but there are
Hmm.
also a lot of things that are really specific and things that each of us don't have in common with the womanhood in air quotes in
Yes.
terms of our prayer lives. So just so you know, our overall goal is to help you to identify areas where your womanhood and your individuality, whatever that looks like, is
Hmm.
going to just where you can, like Alana was saying to me, lean into that.
Yes.
Don't disparage it. Lean
Hmm.
into it and ask God how that can be used in powerful ways to further your prayer life and make your prayers more effective and powerful.
Yeah. I think another important parts to add is that different doesn't mean better or worse, right?
Right.
So men and women have certain stereotypical differences. That doesn't mean that I am better as a woman or more special in God's eyes. I'm just different. And so again, it's kind of there are so many members of the body and it's kind of like, okay, in general, your dominant hand does these things and your non-dominant hand does these things. But that doesn't mean that everybody does this exactly the same way with one hand and not with the other hand, right? Like some of us have more dexterity in our non-dominant hand than others. Some of us are more ambidextrous than others. So a
And then
lot of
there are
our
those that have prehensile prehensile toes and can use their feet.
exactly.
Even better. Even better.
Right. So
Sorry,
find
sorry.
these, no, I think it all is like find the things that make you unique and lean into those. And so much of what shapes our personalities, whether it is on a conscious level or not, whether we like this fact or not, is the fact that we are women, right? So our whole personality has been shaped. Some of it's biology, some of it's the way God designed us, some of it's in our hormones, some of it's culturally shaped. Because I am a woman, I am treated this way. And so this is how I learn to see myself, or this is how I learned to see my role in the world. But we can't, if our biggest goal or our biggest thesis statement is that our prayers are shaped by our unique personalities, then I think the very next absolute must have is, and our personalities are shaped by the fact that we are women in all these facets, right? Some of it's genetics, some of it's the way God designed us, some of it's just the way culture or even our subcultures treat us. And so then we learn to see ourselves in that context. And some of it's very specific to a family, right? And generational stuff. And maybe you come from a family where, like, your mom taught you this one thing, even on a subconscious level, but you learned this one thing about being a woman, right? Or we've talked a little bit about genetic memory, and I don't feel like it needs to be this big, scary, like, far out there thing. I think there's enough science that's not, like bizarre and new agey to say that, yeah, God designed us in a way that if 5 generations ago, one of my great, great, great grandparents experienced that, ooh, this thing is bad, isn't it a gift that God designed a way for that to be passed down generationally, right?
Right. I
So,
mean, you think of instincts in general
mhm.
in all of God's creation and how that could have come to pass through generations.
Yeah. And so you think about how women were treated at certain points in history. You even think about how spiritual women were treated at certain points in history. Again, this might sound a little controversial to some people, but a spiritual Christian woman today whose theology is what we would consider like completely sound, if she had a certain degree of practices of connecting to God that didn't fall in line with what the mainstream church said it must look like, she could have been called a witch and maybe even executed for that. And so, isn't it interesting to think that, okay, so maybe we do have some type of genetically passed down fear that teaches us speaking my mind is dangerous, or being more spiritual appearing than a man, maybe that's dangerous, or things like that. I think that it's really, at the very least, it's very interesting to consider as a possibility that might be in our makeup, and that will absolutely impact our prayers.
Yeah.
So let's go back to communication styles, and let's talk first in very broad generalities of the typical communication style of women and how that impacts our prayers. But then let's also talk about how to know your own unique communication style and how that can impact your prayers. So when we talk about very, very broad generalities, what are some of the ways that a woman communicates?
You kind of touched on it. I mean, you touched on it a little bit before. I mean, some of our communication is nonverbal, and
Mm-hmm.
it is in our demeanor, it's in our body language, it's in subtle things that
Mm-hmm.
may not be picked up at first. But I think you're talking more about like verbal communication. Is that
No,
kind of what you're?
both. Both.
Okay.
I think what you were talking about, how does that impact, how can that impact our prayers, would you say?
I would say that there are times, and there are women, and I'm one of them, where your posture can affect your, I don't know, the way you feel. about prayer and
Absolutely.
praying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I'm not the kind of person that I have to get down on my knees and put my hands together. I know there are people I've talked to that are like, I have to be on my knees to pray. I just can't, I have to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not
Mm-hmm.
like that. I like to pray on the fly, pray on the go. But so I do this thing in church. Whenever there's a prayer, I cross my legs a lot, just comfort
Mm-hmm.
wise. I'm probably going to have spider veins and
Oh
already
no.
have a few, but as a result, but I cross my legs a lot just because it's the way I sit comfortably. But I've noticed that I sort of unconsciously or whatever, subconsciously, I uncross my legs when we pray, like
Mm-hmm.
when anyone
Mm-hmm.
prays. And I don't know, it's just like that small nuance change in posture
Mm-hmm.
helps me to feel a little more reverent and
Yeah.
a little bit more like prostrate, even though
Mm-hmm.
I'm not on my knees.
Yeah.
And other times, there are times, and I've talked about this before, there are times when I am so like filled with praise, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
singing and prayer through praise, or just in my prayers, supplicating, just when I'm just really intense and passionate about praying to God, I will either have to lift my hands, or if I feel like I'll be a distraction, like there are certain places
Mm-hmm.
I've been where I'm like, okay, no one else is raising their hands. I'm not going to be that guy that draws
Right.
attention to myself and detracts from worship, but I raise my spiritual hands and
Yes.
I don't, and so like I close my eyes and I am raising my hands spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
in terms of prayer, like those kinds of things, sometimes I'll take my shoes and my socks off and stand in the
Mm-hmm.
grass
Mm-hmm.
and be kind of connected to the ground. And that makes me somehow feel closer to God sometimes. I
Mm-hmm.
can't explain that either, but just things like that do
Yeah.
impact my connection with God,
Yeah.
those little
I
things.
almost see, especially the legs crossing, it's almost a prayer trigger, right? It's telling yourself,
Yeah,
now is the time that I pray. Kind of like when I put on my purple sweater, now is the time that I podcast and get on
right?
video. It is a visual reminder. And there is so much science now that shows how our posture does impact our mood. The one that I remember hearing, they set up these mock job interviews. And half of the applicants just went into the interview and did this mock interview. The other half were told to stand kind of in superwoman stance. Can you picture what I'm saying? So your feet a little bit apart, your hands and fists like right on your hips. You're standing really tall. They were instructed to stand that way. It was like 2 minutes or less. And then like they weren't given any other instruction other than that. And then they asked the interviewers who didn't know the purpose of this to basically just rate how impressed they were by each applicant, how likely they would be to hire them in a real setting. And the people who had done this like power stance were given higher ratings on average. And it was just, again, what you were saying, a reminder that our posture can influence a lot about us. Like when you're clenched, that tells your body that you're scared. One thing I've been
Mm.
trying to
Oh,
do
interesting.
is, I will try to get outside time every day, even in the cold. And the more I can teach my body not to clench in the cold, the more relaxed I am and the more I enjoy that experience. Because when you're clenched, it tells your body, I'm in a defensive position. When you're just calm and relaxed, it's telling your body, I am safe. And for some of us, our prayers will flow more naturally if we've got that I am safe to pray in this setting. Or I love what you said about lifting up your spiritual hands. For people who have no idea what we're talking about, can you explain what you mean by that?
So I just usually I'll have to close my eyes to kind of feel like that. I guess
Uh-huh.
I don't always have to, but
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of, I mean, basically, it's imagining myself to the point
Mm-hmm.
where I almost feel like I'm lifting my hands up and just
Mm-hmm.
like raising
Yeah.
them up. And it's basically just imagining like stretching my thoughts and my worship upward is kind of
Yeah.
what it feels like. But in the basic sense, it's just stretching, imagining that I'm lifting my hands and stretching them way up and
Yeah.
praising God while I'm singing or praying.
Yeah. I was shocked again, another science discovery. I was shocked to learn is that like you can imagine yourself lifting weights and it will actually grow your muscle mass.
Are you
And
serious? I have not
yes,
heard that. I
it's
have not heard
and the
that.
more detailed you make it, so it's not just like I'm going to be laying in bed. Yeah, maybe like here's how I do bicep curls. But it's like I feel the weights in my hand. I picture exactly how I am standing. I feel the muscles contracting while I am straining against these weights and it will grow your muscle mass.
Oh my
It's
goodness.
yes. And so there is this idea of being able to picture yourself in a type of setting, and that can influence your prayers. And I love it's a perfect hack. You can do it in a way where like you don't look weird while you're doing it, which is kind of perfect.
Right, exactly. Because, I mean, there's a fine line between being yourself and worshiping like
Mm-hmm.
you and not
Mm-hmm.
distracting others when you're in a
Exactly.
corporate setting. You want to walk that line for sure.
Exactly. And reading the room. In some churches, you're going to be distracting people by not getting into it. Like the
Right.
singer up front's going to be like, "What's wrong with her? Are we doing a terrible job?" And so
Yeah.
you've got to kind of know the setting that you're in.
Yep.
Well, I also like what you talked about, going back to communication styles. And you had talked about a lot of women do communicate non-verbally. And I think that that could also be a great reminder that prayer does not always have to be in full sentences with
Yes. I love that.
punctuation and proper grammar. I think that it should be sometimes, but prayer can also be like lifting up your heart to the Lord, lifting up your emotions to the Lord, sitting with your joy or sitting with your sadness or sitting with your anxiety, but directing all of those feelings up to God. There is absolutely a type of nonverbal prayer that I think we can lean into. And again, it does the entire church a disservice when we teach everybody that prayer is just, dear God, full paragraph, amen. There are so many other ways it can be. And then I was also thinking about communication styles. In general, we have this stereotype like when men get together, they're going to talk about sports or when you and I get together, we're talking about like our deepest darkest feelings. Like we can go deep into our emotion, like we have a bigger vocabulary in general to speak about our emotional lives. And I think that's also a really good reminder that if you were to mic up my prayer life and my husband's prayer life, I guarantee you I'm spending a lot more time talking to God about how I feel. And
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that I am self-centered and self-absorbed. And it doesn't mean that my husband is lacking in connection to the Lord. It just means that this is how we are wired differently. I wouldn't feel fulfilled if I showed up at Utah and we spent 3 hours talking about hockey scores.
You're right.
Whereas for some people and stereotypically some men, that's a really great connection, right? Like that's a nice reminder. I was actually, again, I'm going back to all these science studies, which is hilarious today.
I love it. I love it.
But there is actually, as much as some of us hate it, there is something physiologically that is beneficial about small talk. And the way I understood it was it is a signal to our brain that everything's fine. Because if
Mm.
I see you at the store and I say, "Did you hear there's an avalanche coming and the road's going to be closed?" That is an important thing for me to communicate. If I see you at the store and I say, "Hi, Jamie, how's it going?" What I am actually communicating to you is there's no urgent danger that I need to tell you. Kind of like how waving hands, most people expect that it was a signal like, "Hey, there's no weapon in my hand," right?
Oh,
It's kind of the
interesting.
sense of like, "Hi, how's it going?" is almost the verbal equivalent of there is nothing about to attack us.
That's really interesting. I had never thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so it is very okay if you're the kind of person who's just throwing up popcorn prayers throughout the day and you're like sitting with God with my feelings. What? Or, no, I don't want to sit for an hour and journal out my emotions in a prayer journal. That's fine. Right. But if your connection, so if you're having a hard time, you're listening and you're having a hard time even knowing, well, I don't even know what my communication style is. Think about the best hour you could spend with your closest friend. And I actually encourage you to not make it a romantic partner, a spouse, or significant other. I picture just your most satisfying conversation with like the closest non-romantic person in your life. So maybe like a mom or a sister or just a Jamie if you've got a Jamie in your life. What is the most satisfying hour you could spend with them? Like I was talking to my business partner about going to visit you. It's just like, oh, so did you guys go? Like, what'd you guys go and do? I'm like, we sat in Jamie's kitchen and drank coffee. And that is exactly what I wanted to do.
I know, and we talked about it. It's like neither of us would have planned like outings or,
No, ew.
it's like I had you cook some fried rice
No.
and yeah, and we had some coffee and talked a
Yeah.
lot and did some podcast stuff and some work. I mean, just working side by side was really fun
Yes.
and fulfilling.
Well, and that's for me. This is one thing that makes me different than a lot of other women I know. It is fulfilling to work on a project with a friend.
Yes, yeah.
My love language is inviting you to like enter into a business venture with me.
Right? Yes.
You know, because I am less, I have never gone to somebody and said, "Hey, do you want to spend Wednesday from 1 to 2 talking about our feelings?" But I would be like, "Hey, do you want to meet together once a week and do a podcast together? Or do you want to write a book with me?" Or things like that. And so again, if you were to mic up my prayers and you were to mic up Jamie's prayers, for example, I do spend a lot of time talking to God about business stuff. And for some people, that would be like, why is she so self-absorbed? But I know that my love language is talking to the people I am closest to and working on projects with them. And so when I write a new novel, I spend a lot of time praying to God about that novel, not because I'm self-absorbed, but because that is my way of bringing God into like one of my closest things. Similar to your kids, like I had a lot of fun last night. My son had a science test today and he had been away on a basketball trip. So he hadn't had all the in-class time that the other students had. And he had a study guide. And we just sat at the table and he wrote down answers in the study guide and I checked them against the answer key and we talked about it. Like to me, that was satisfying communication. That was
Hmm.
satisfying time, quality time spent with my kid. For other people, that would be pulling teeth. It's like, what? I've got to do homework with my child. And so think about what makes you feel like you have had a satisfactory time spent with somebody. Is that working on a project? Is that let's just drink lattes and talk about the deepest, darkest? Like, I was shocked. We have known each other 15 plus years now, maybe something along those lines. And I was at your table. I'm like, so I've told you about this, and it was one of my like deep dark secrets from high
Right.
school.
And I was
And
like,
your eyes
no,
went
you never told
wide.
me that. I
I'm
didn't
like,
know about that.
okay, we need more coffee. Let's dive in, right?
Yeah. No,
So,
that's so funny.
so if that's your style, then go to God deep. And if your style is, like Scott's communication style is, I want to be able to say whatever's on the tip of my tongue and have you there to hear me and to know that you're kind of paying attention, right? So like it would be annoying for him if we were doing totally different things in the same room and I had my headphones on and couldn't even hear him because he likes to popcorn his thoughts out. And sometimes they're not even thoughts, sometimes they're like silly like song lyrics that he makes up, right? If that's your communication style, you're going to be the popcorn prayer, right? So what about you? Not so now let's move away from the generalities. What about your communication style do you know is something that's unique to you, and how does that impact your prayers, or how can that shape your prayer life?
Okay, that's a good one. That's a lot. Let me think. So, I would say my communication style is very kind of stream of consciousness. Like I've mentioned, I
Mm-hmm.
don't distill my thoughts a ton, like
Mm-hmm.
when I'm communicating. And so that's kind of how it is with God.
Yeah.
I, but okay, so I'll sit on that for a minute, but I want to go back to something we talked about before. So I will just kind of lay it out there, whether it's in my journal, writing and writing and writing, just all of the,
Yeah.
things in great detail. But it's more like throughout the day. The majority of my prayer life is just kind of talking to God throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be about random stuff. It can be about important things too, but just kind of the stream of
Yeah.
consciousness, like this is what's going on with me and inviting him into that. But on the other hand, I do want to go back to that nonverbal prayer because for a long time I didn't realize that that was a thing, and
Mm-hmm.
or at the very least I felt alone in processing certain emotions.
Yeah.
And when I learned, I mean I don't know if it was the first time, but I do remember one time just being overcome with grief
Mm-hmm.
and just overwhelmed and hopeless at that moment,
Yeah.
and standing there and again lifting up my spiritual hands to God and
Mm-hmm.
just sitting there and not saying anything,
Yeah.
but just sitting there and feeling, but inviting God into that feeling, directing those feelings
Mm-hmm.
upward. And it was, I'm trying to think of what it would be like. It was like, I don't know, maybe like in some kind of sci-fi show like Star Trek, where someone gets
Mm-hmm.
injured and you put them in the little pod that heals them,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and they're just in there. They're not doing anything, but there's something
Mm-hmm.
going on in there. That's how I
Right.
felt. I felt
Yes.
like I was standing in God's presence, and instead of just ruminating all of these bad, horrible
Mm-hmm.
feelings and emotions, I directed them toward God, and I felt like I received something back too. And
Yeah.
like I just felt like God and me were intermingling in a way that brought healing, and not
Mm-hmm.
that everything was just perfect, but I
Yes.
felt restored and I felt poured into. And I
Mm-hmm.
just think that has become a very important part of my prayer life, is just recognizing that I don't have to spew out words, that when I'm in a
Yes.
place where I can't just do the stream of consciousness talking,
Mm-hmm.
that I can just be.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that I do find ironically, because I like the words, is when I get to a point where it feels too cumbersome or I just don't have time
Uh-huh.
to spell out all of the words of what I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to pray, or I might not know all of them or what I even
Mm-hmm.
want to pray. I
Mm-hmm.
do more of that, just nonverbal,
Yeah.
kind of in my head. I'm like, okay, God, take this feeling. And I just, whatever
Yes.
the feeling is,
Exactly.
it's like all of my words of my prayer for my
Mm-hmm.
son or my daughter or my husband or my
Mm-hmm.
friends, like it's just wrapped up into this desire and feeling and intention. And
Yeah.
I almost feel like it would do it a disservice to try and put English words to it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just like, okay, God, take this. I almost envision God taking this bundle of
Yeah.
intention,
Yes.
and I just lift it up to him. I'm like, okay, take it. It's in your
Yeah.
court. You know what it is. And then I feel so relieved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes I feel like we give the picture I have in my head is like a ball of yarn. And sometimes it's in a nice ball and there's the one piece and we just kind of string it along and
Right?
we give God that prayer in one sentence after another. And sometimes it is a knotted mess and we don't even know where the beginning or the end are. And we just say, God, this is the string of thoughts and the string of emotions, and neither one's better than the other. And I think that I would hear people talking about, oh, I pray to God throughout the day, and it would sometimes make me feel less than. It'd be like, I don't know that I do that. because because I am not a chit chatter. And
Right.
this is something Scott has had to learn about me. When we go on these long car trips, I am super happy sitting for 90 minutes. And to me, it's together time and it's relaxing. And to him, it's like, why aren't you communicating with me?
Are you mad at me? Why aren't you talking?
Yeah. And so, because to me, like coming up with chit chat is a little bit more mentally draining, I am not. I'm not like you. I don't do popcorn prayers as effectively as some people do. And that used to make me feel less than. That used to make me be like, these people say it's so easy. Like a person pops into their mind and they like in a sentence in their brain think, dear God, please help this person to be having a good day. I'm like, how do you find the energy to do that? It's kind of like, how would I find the energy to keep up small talk on a 5 hour road trip?
Yeah, well, and then on the flip side, we discovered this about each other that I was very, like very envious of your ability to pray so fervently and
Hmm.
pointedly and concentrated prayers,
Yeah.
for your prayer burden, for North Korea,
Hmm.
for just all of the, you kind of instructed me in a lot of ways on praying in a concentrated way. And I felt less
Hmm.
than too, because I'm like, that's
Yes.
hard for me.
Yeah.
My hummingbird brain doesn't stay focused on prayer for
Hmm.
as long as that goes. And so
Yeah.
it's just one more example of leaning into praying
Exactly.
like you. But at the same time, I've benefited from stretching myself in other
Same.
areas of prayer. And so it doesn't mean that you should just say, "Oh, that's not me," and just go on.
Exactly.
There's nothing wrong with admiring a way someone prays and stretching yourself a little bit, test it out,
Right.
see if maybe you can learn something and kind of add to your prayer arsenal through
Hmm.
someone else's strengths.
Yeah. It's kind of like if you think about creating a well-rounded fitness routine for yourself. You want
Mm,
to focus on the type of fitness that works for your schedule, your body, your disposition. But like if I did that, I would just be like in 2 to 3 minute yoga poses like all day, and like it's super relaxing. I love it. There's a little bit of other benefits in terms of like flexibility and stuff, but it's not, not really the best for cardio. It's okay, but not really, so sometimes I will lift weights, right? So again, I feel like it doesn't let us off the hook to realize, oh, I'm not good at chit chat. I'm never going to popcorn pray. I don't think that's the correct response. But, oh, I'm not good at chit chat. I should not feel guilty that I don't popcorn pray as much as somebody else, or I shouldn't feel guilty that that is not my primary way of connecting with the Lord. I think that's perfect. And in addition, I can just remind myself that it's going to take a little more effort to focus on that sum. It's never going to be, I'm never going to completely try to flip-flop my communication style and be the kind of person who only popcorn prays. But I can tell myself, okay, I want to get 1% better at remembering to do this during the day. And in your case, it's no, you're not designed to be the kind of person who sets aside 90 minutes at a chunk, right? For it to feel like a fulfilling connection with God, you need 2 hours. That's not what works with your schedule, your personality, your brain makeup. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever stretch yourself to have a longer time, right? So it's about becoming well-rounded, but it's also about leaning into the way God designed you. So I would encourage everybody to just ask God to give you some insights into your own communication style. I think some great questions to ask yourself are, what's the most fulfilling type of hour you could spend with a cherished loved one? When Scott and I, it was the night before our wedding, and we didn't have a traditional rehearsal dinner or anything like that. We just had, I think we each had, there were like 3 men, 3 women in kind of the party. And the 3 guys went outside and spent like 4 hours looking at a car that had an issue going on with it. And there were 3 of us girls, and we sat on the couch talking about someone's recent breakup. And it was the perfect night for both of us to spend with our friends, right?
yeah.
And so think about that kind of thing. If you're the kind of person who likes to tinker when you're, like Scott and these guys, maybe your best prayer time is going to be while you're working on the car or while you're I don't even know enough about like home upkeep to come up with other examples, but maybe that's it for you. So, and I want to end with one more, like we're talking about this in generalities, but we all feel less than a woman in certain areas. So don't let that play into it. Lean into who you are. Maybe you've been told that you communicate like a man. Maybe you're brusque. Maybe you don't have a large emotional vocabulary. That is totally okay. That does not make you less of a woman. It's just lean into then how God made you. If you communicate in grunts, maybe the prayer equivalent is kind of the popcorn prayers. Help God, or stuff like that. But also, yeah, never completely neglect something just because it's outside of your communication style or your comfort zone, right? But don't feel less than because that is not where you spend the most of your time and energy. Anything else you want to add about just prayer and communication styles?
No, I liked this conversation. It kind of went a different direction than we thought, and I like it. I think it's so relevant. And I kind of even, just in talking through some of these things, I realized things about myself. So I hope that's true for our
Yeah.
listeners too, that you guys are able to just, that this would be a conversation starter with yourself and God, just to be
Mhm.
able to unravel some of those things.
Yeah. I think another question that can get you thinking about different communication styles, if you have kids, you can ask yourself, okay, how does my kid like to communicate? And if you've got more than one kid, it's going to be likely that it's going to be in different ways. And so again, this kind of comes back to just, love languages and how do you like to spend time with somebody? How do you communicate? With my oldest, our communication style is I send him funny pictures of our dogs while he's off at college, right? And my youngest, I find like funny basketball memes and things that I think he'll find hilarious, and I send them to him, and like I'll be like, "Did you see that?" I'm like, "See what?" So that is not his communication style. So awesome. Well, I am glad we get to have this discussion. Don't forget you can find your link to get She Prays Like a Girl in the show notes. You can follow us on Instagram to hear more about that too at Praying Christian Women. And we hope you all have a beautiful, blessed day.